Chapter 1. The Empty Pulpit. The morning sun cast long shadows across the ancient churchyard of St. Bartholomew's, where weathered headstones stood like silent sentinels among the overgrown grass. Miss Jane Marple adjusted her rather worn gloves and stepped carefully along the flagstone path, her keen blue eyes taking in every detail of the familiar scene. The church bells had rung at their usual time of 9 o'clock, calling the faithful of Little Wickham to Sunday service, yet something felt distinctly amiss. "Most peculiar," murmured Mrs. Dolly Bantry, Miss Marple's closest friend, as she caught up with her at the church door. "But I passed the vicarage on my way here, and there wasn't a soul about. Not even Mrs. Clement hanging out the washing, which she always does before service." Miss Marple's expression remained placid, though her mind had already begun its quiet cataloguing of irregularities. In her 70-odd years of life in this sleepy English village, she had observed that people were remarkably creatures of habit. The Reverend Samuel Clement had never once missed a Sunday service in his 15 years at St. Bartholomew's, not even when he'd suffered from that dreadful bout of influenza the previous winter. The church was unusually full this morning, as it always was on the first Sunday of June, when the annual Flower Festival Committee announced their plans for the coming week. Miss Marple settled into her customary pew, third from the front on the left side, where the morning light fell just so across her prayer book. Around her the congregation rustled with anticipation and barely contained whispers. I do hope nothing's happened to dear Samuel," fretted Miss Lavinia Croft, the elderly organist who had been playing for the church longer than anyone could remember. Her fingers, though still nimble on the keys, trembled slightly as she adjusted her music. He seemed rather distracted after the parish council meeting on Thursday evening. The parish council meeting. Miss Marple filed this information away with the mental precision of a librarian cataloguing books. She had not attended Thursday's meeting herself, being occupied with her nephew Raymond's unexpected visit, but she made a mental note to inquire about it later. In her experience, parish council meetings in Little Wickham were rarely occasions for dramatic revelations, but they often served as the breeding ground for exactly the sort of small tensions that could grow into something much larger. At precisely 10 o'clock, when the service should have begun, Major Reginald Burnaby rose from his seat in the front pew and approached the pulpit. His military bearing was unmistakable even in his civilian Sunday best, and his voice carried the same authority that had once commanded a regiment in India. "Ladies and gentlemen," the Major began, his weathered face grave, "I'm afraid I must inform you that Reverend Clement appears to be indisposed this morning. Miss Croft and I took the liberty of checking the vicarage when he failed to appear at his usual time. The house appears to be empty, though his bed shows signs of having been slept in." A collective murmur rippled through the congregation like wind through wheat. Miss Marple observed the various reactions with interest. Mrs. Wainwright, the village postmistress, looked deeply concerned and made the sign of the cross. Young Dr. Nicholas Pemberton, recently arrived to assist the aging Dr. Haydock, frowned and checked his watch, as though precise timing might somehow solve the mystery. The three Mrs. Skinner, spinster sisters who had appointed themselves the village's unofficial moral guardians, exchanged meaningful glances that spoke volumes about their theories regarding the vicar's absence. "Has anyone thought to check whether his motor car is missing?" inquired Colonel Clithering, his voice carrying across the church with military precision. The colonel, though retired, maintained the bearing of a man accustomed to taking charge of situations. "The Austin is still in the garage," replied Tom Bradley, the church sexton, who had arrived late and was standing near the back door, cap in hand. "Checked it myself when Major Burnaby asked me to look round the grounds." Miss Marple's attention sharpened. She had noticed Tom earlier, hurrying across the churchyard with unusual haste, his face flushed as though he had been running. The sexton was a methodical man, not given to dramatics or unnecessary exertion. What might have prompted such urgency this morning? "Perhaps," suggested Mrs. Bantry, "we should organise a search party. Samuel might have gone for an early morning walk and suffered some mishap. You know how treacherous those river paths can be, especially after the rain we've had this week." The idea gained immediate support among the congregation, particularly from the younger men who seemed eager for any excuse to avoid a lay reading of morning prayer. Miss Marple, however, remained seated as the discussion of search parties and possible routes grew animated around her. Her fingers smoothed the pages of her prayer book absently while her mind worked through the available information. She had walked past the vicarage herself at 8:30 that morning on her way to post a letter to her great-niece Diana. The house had appeared quiet, but not unusually so for a Sunday morning. The curtains in the front parlour had been drawn, also normal, as Samuel Clement was a private man who preferred his morning prayers in solitude. What struck her now, in retrospect, was the absence of any smoke from the chimney. Even in June, the vicar typically lit a small fire in the morning to ward off the persistent dampness of the old vicarage. "Miss Marple?" She looked up to find young Dr. Pemberton standing beside her pew, his dark eyes concerned. "I was wondering if you might have seen Reverend Clement recently. Mrs. Bantry mentioned you often take your morning walks quite early." "No, since Friday afternoon," Miss Marple replied truthfully. "I encountered him near the bridge when I was returning from visiting Mrs. Pollock. He seemed in perfectly good health, though perhaps a bit preoccupied. He mentioned something about a letter he'd received that morning, though he didn't elaborate on its contents." Dr. Pemberton made a mental note of this information, his medical training evident in his systematic approach. Was there anything else unusual about his manner? Miss Marple considered carefully. He did seem rather concerned about something. Not ill, you understand, but as one might be when facing a difficult decision. I did notice he was carrying his briefcase, which struck me as odd for a Friday afternoon stroll. Before Dr. Pemberton could respond further, a commotion arose near the church entrance. Mr. George Lumsden, the village constable, had arrived and was deep in conversation with Major Burnaby. The two men's grave expressions and lowered voices immediately commanded the attention of the entire congregation. "Ladies and gentlemen," Major Burnaby called out, returning to the front of the church, "Constable Lumsden has just informed me that Reverend Clement's housekeeper, Mrs. Clement, returned from her visit to her sister in Maryleborough this morning to find the vicarage in a state of some disorder." The collective intake of breath was audible. Mrs. Clement was the vicar's widowed elder sister, a formidable woman who had kept house for him since his arrival in Little Wickham. She was not the sort to describe anything as disordered, unless it truly warranted such strong language. "The study appears to have been searched quite thoroughly," Constable Lumsden added, his young face serious beneath his constable's helmet. "Papers scattered about, drawers pulled out, that sort of thing. Mrs. Clement insists nothing appears to be missing, but she's quite certain someone has been through her brother's private papers. Miss Marple absorbed this information with growing interest. A vicar's study searched, papers disturbed, and the vicar himself nowhere to be found. In her experience, such circumstances rarely pointed to simple misadventure or sudden illness. Someone had been looking for something specific in Samuel Clement's private papers, and they had been systematic about it. "Has anyone telephoned the police in Much Benham?" asked Colonel Clithering, his practical mind moving toward official channels. "I've sent word," Constable Lumsden confirmed. "They'll be sending an inspector round this afternoon. In the meantime, I'll be cordoning off the vicarage and asking everyone to stay clear of the grounds." As the congregation began to disperse, many heading home in small groups, discussing the morning's startling development in hushed tones, Miss Marple remained seated. She watched the various faces around her, noting expressions and reactions with the attention of a naturalist observing birds in their native habitat. Mrs. Wainwright appeared genuinely distressed, dabbing at her eyes with a pocket handkerchief. The Mrs. Skinner looked thrilled rather than concerned, clearly anticipating weeks of delicious speculation and gossip. Dr. Pemberton maintained his professional composure, though Miss Marple detected an underlying tension in his manner that seemed disproportionate to his acquaintance with the vicar. Most interesting of all was Tom Bradley, who lingered near the altar, unnecessarily straightening chairs and tidying hymn books with the concentrated attention of someone deliberately avoiding involvement in the general discussion. "Jane?" Mrs. Bantry touched her arm gently. "Shall we walk back together? I confess this whole business has rather unsettled me." Miss Marple rose, gathering her prayer book and handbag with deliberate care. "Of course, dear, though I do think we might stop by Mrs. Pollock's cottage on the way. She keeps such a careful eye on the comings and goings along Church Lane. She might have noticed something useful." As they made their way out of the church, Miss Marple cast one final glance back at the empty pulpit. In 40 years of attending services at St. Bartholomew's, she had never seen it standing vacant during the appointed hour for morning prayer. Change in her experience rarely came to Little Wickham without bringing secrets to light, and this particular change felt like the opening note of a symphony she had heard variations of many times before. The only question now was what secrets the Reverend Samuel Clement had been keeping, and who had found them worth searching for in the dark hours of a Saturday night. Chapter 2. Whispers over tea. Miss Marple's instinct to visit Mrs. Pollock proved providential. The elderly widow lived in Rose Cottage, strategically positioned where Church Lane met the High Street, offering an unobstructed view of both the vicarage and Little Wickham's main thoroughfares. More importantly, chronic insomnia had made Mrs. Pollock the village's unofficial night watchman. "Saturday evening, you say?" Mrs. Pollock repeated, setting down her china teacup with unusual care. Miss Marple noticed a slight tremor in the old woman's hands that hadn't been there during her previous visit. "Yes, dear," Miss Marple encouraged gently. "We were wondering if you might have noticed any unusual activity around the vicarage. You know how sounds carry at night." Mrs. Pollock glanced toward the window. "Well, I did hear the vicarage gate creak around 11:30. Distinctive sound, that gate. Samuel's been meaning to oil those hinges for months. But then he often took evening walks when troubled about something." "Troubled?" Mrs. Bantry leaned forward. Did he seem troubled recently? Oh, my dear Mrs. Bantry, our vicar has been quite unlike himself since that dreadful business with the church roof fund. Mrs. Pollock's voice dropped to a whisper. Not that I listen to gossip, but one can hardly help overhearing when Mrs. Wainwright discusses parish finances with such enthusiasm. Miss Marple maintained her polite expression while filing away this reference to financial troubles. I'm sure it's nothing serious. These old churches require constant maintenance. Perhaps not, Mrs. Pollock agreed, though her tone suggested otherwise. But I did notice something odd on Friday morning. A motorcycle arrived at the vicarage around 10 o'clock, one of those noisy modern things. The rider wore a helmet, so I couldn't make out who it was, but they stayed nearly an hour. This was new information, and Miss Marple felt the familiar quickening of interest. How unusual! The Reverend doesn't typically receive weekday morning visitors. Precisely what struck me as odd. When the motorcycle departed, Samuel came out to watch it go. He stood in his garden for the longest time afterward, just staring down the lane. Not like him at all. He usually has such purposeful movements. Did you recognize the motorcycle? Mrs. Bantry asked. Red and black, quite new. Rather too large for our village roads. Nearly sideswiped Mrs. Henderson's cat when it turned onto the high street. Miss Marple noted the timing. The mysterious visitor had arrived Friday morning, the same day she'd encountered the vicar carrying his briefcase and looking troubled. The letter he'd mentioned receiving that morning might well have announced this visitor's arrival. After leaving Mrs. Pollock, Miss Marple and Mrs. Bantry walked back along Church Lane. The vicarage stood forlorn behind its hedgerow. Constable Lumsden's official notice tied to the gate with yellow rope, cordoning off the front garden. A penny for your thoughts, Jane, Mrs. Bantry ventured as they approached the village green. I was thinking about patterns, dear, Miss Marple replied absently. How people's routines tell us so much. Samuel's evening walk on Saturday. Mrs. Pollock mentioned he took them when troubled, but he typically walked toward the river path, not toward the village proper. They paused beside the war memorial, where villagers had gathered in small groups, their voices carrying the unmistakable cadence of concerned gossip. Miss Marple recognized Dr. Pemberton deep in conversation with Major Burnaby, while the Mrs. Skinner held court near the wooden bench. I do hope they haven't harmed him, came Miss Croft's tremulous voice. Such a gentle soul, our Samuel. Prevention of crime is simple compared to detection, Miss Marple murmured quietly to Mrs. Bantry. But when the crime has occurred, we must look for what has changed, not what has remained the same. Colonel Clithering approached them, his face bearing the expression of a man who had spent his military career solving logistical puzzles. Miss Marple, Mrs. Bantry, dreadful business this. I've suggested organising a proper search, but that young doctor thinks we should wait for the police. From Much Benham. Very sensible of Dr. Pemberton, Miss Marple observed, though I wonder what medical opinion he might have formed. Professional discretion, no doubt. Though between you and me, the Colonel lowered his voice, I've heard whispers about financial irregularity involving the church accounts. Nothing substantiated, but in my experience, when a man disappears and his papers have been ransacked. Miss Marple considered this carefully. Financial impropriety would explain the systematic search of his study, as well as his recent troubled demeanour. Yet something felt incomplete, like a jigsaw puzzle, with pieces from different boxes mixed in. Dr. Pemberton excused himself from Major Burnaby and approached them, medical bag in hand. Miss Marple noticed he moved with deliberate effort to appear unhurried. "Ladies, Colonel Clithering, I don't suppose any of you have additional information about Reverend Clement's recent activities. As the village's medical professional, I feel responsible to ensure we haven't overlooked health-related explanations." "Has he complained of any ailments recently?" Mrs. Bantry asked with concern. "Not directly, though I've only been in practice. Here 6 months. Dr. Haydock has been treating the vicar's occasional insomnia, but nothing suggesting sudden medical emergency." Miss Marple found this interesting. Insomnia? I hadn't realized Samuel suffered from sleeplessness. Rather severely, according to Dr. Haydock's notes. Apparently worsened considerably after the new year. He'd been prescribed mild sedative, though he rarely used it, preferring evening walks as natural remedy. The pieces accumulated in Miss Marple's mind like books being shelved. Insomnia since January. Financial concerns, mysterious visitor, and now disappearance following systematic search of private papers. Each fact seemed significant, yet none formed a complete picture. Tom Bradley appeared at the edge of the green, having emerged from behind the church. His clothes showed signs of recent work. Soil on trousers and grass stains on shirt, though it was Sunday, when the sexton typically confined himself to minimal duties. Miss Marple watched as he hesitated, debating whether to join the groups or head home directly. "Tom!" Colonel Clithering called. "Any sign of disturbance around the church grounds?" Bradley approached reluctantly, cap twisted between weathered hands. "Nothing obvious, sir, though I did notice." Well, there were fresh footprints in the soft earth beside the vestry door. Could be from yesterday evening, hard to say. Footprints. Dr. Pemberton's interest sharpened. What sort? Small boots, I'd say. Not work boots like mine, but proper walking shoes. And there were cigarette butts nearby. 3 of them, all smoked down to the filter. Miss Marple absorbed this with particular attention. Samuel Clement had never been a smoker, considering it incompatible with his pastoral duties. Someone had stood outside the church for some time, Saturday evening, smoking and presumably watching something. Did Reverend Clement typically work in the church Saturday evenings? She inquired. Sometimes, Miss Marple, especially when preparing special services or working on parish accounts. He found it peaceful after dark, he said. Fewer interruptions. Parish accounts again. Miss Marple began to suspect that whatever troubled the vicar was intimately connected with the church's financial affairs. Yet the presence of a watcher suggested something more complex than simple embezzlement or mismanagement. As the groups gradually dispersed, each villager returning home to Sunday roast and afternoon quiet, Miss Marple remained on the green with Mrs. Bantry. The shadows had grown longer, and the church bell tower cast a dark line across the grass. "Jane, you've got that look," Mrs. Bantry observed. "The same expression you had when Mrs. Spenlow's husband supposedly died of natural causes, and you suspected otherwise." Miss Marple smiled slightly. "Human nature, dear Dolly, follows such predictable patterns. Someone wanted something from Samuel's study badly enough to risk breaking into the vicarage, yet Mrs. Clement says nothing appears missing, which suggests either they found what they sought or what they sought was never there to begin with," Mrs. Bantry finished. Precisely. And that, I think, might explain our missing vicar far better than theories of financial impropriety or sudden medical emergencies. As they walked toward their respective homes, Miss Marple found herself thinking about cigarettes smoked in patient waiting, mysterious visitors on motorcycles, and the particular quality of desperation that drove people to search another's private papers in the dead of night. By Monday morning, she suspected, the police from Much Benham would arrive with their official procedures and scientific methods. But until then, the game belonged to observation, patience, and a thorough understanding of how ordinary people behaved when they believed themselves unobserved. Chapter 3. Monday Morning. Revelations Monday morning brought Inspector Dermot Craddock from Much Benham, arriving in Little Wickham promptly at 9 o'clock in a police motor car that drew curious glances from every cottage window along the High Street. Miss Marple, having finished her breakfast and morning correspondence, positioned herself strategically in her front garden with a pair of secateurs and her prize roses. The roses, she told herself, genuinely needed attention, but their proximity to the vicarage and her excellent hearing made them an ideal location for observation. Inspector Craddock was a lean man in his early 40s, with intelligent dark eyes and the brisk efficiency of someone accustomed to dealing with rural crimes that usually involved little more than petty theft or the occasional domestic dispute. Miss Marple had encountered him briefly the previous year during the unfortunate business with Mrs. McGillicuddy's train, and remembered him as both thorough and surprisingly open to unconventional insights. Mrs. Clement had returned from her sister's Sunday evening, and Miss Marple could hear raised voices from within the vicarage as the inspector questioned the housekeeper. The conversation seemed rather heated, though she could not make out specific words through the old stone walls. "Most unseemly, all this commotion," declared Mrs. Wainwright, who had appeared at Miss Marple's garden gate with the Morning Post, though the letters surely could have waited until her regular afternoon round. Poor Mrs. Clement looked absolutely distraught when I saw her this morning, kept muttering about those dreadful people and what Samuel would think. Miss Marple snipped a particularly stubborn stem, her expression thoughtful. How very distressing for her. Did she elaborate on who these dreadful people might have been? Well, she mentioned something about strangers asking questions around the village Saturday afternoon. Apparently someone had been inquiring about the vicar at the Lamb and Flag, though George Lumsden said he hadn't heard anything about it. Mrs. Wainwright lowered her voice conspiratorially. "Between you and me, Miss Marple, I think there's more to this business than a simple disappearance." Before Miss Marple could respond, Dr. Pemberton emerged from the vicarage, his face grave. He paused briefly to speak with Constable Lumsden, then walked briskly towards the village proper. Miss Marple noted he carried what appeared to be a brown paper package under his arm. "Excuse me, Mrs. Wainwright," Miss Marple said, setting down her secateurs. "I believe I'll take a quick walk to the post office. I'm expecting word from my nephew Raymond." The post office occupied the ground floor of Mrs. Wainwright's cottage and served as the unofficial nerve centre of village communication. Miss Marple arrived just as Dr. Pemberton was leaving, having conducted what appeared to be an urgent conversation with Mrs. Wainwright's daughter, young Ethel, who helped with the telephone exchange. "Dr. Pemberton," Miss Marple called pleasantly. "How fortunate to encounter you. I do hope the inspector's investigation is proceeding smoothly." The doctor paused, clearly weighing his words carefully. As well as can be expected, Miss Marple, though I must say some of the information that's come to light is rather troubling. Oh dear, nothing too serious, I hope. I'm afraid I can't discuss the details, but Inspector Craddock has asked me to examine certain medical records. It seems Reverend Clement had been more unwell than any of us realized. Miss Marple's eyebrows rose slightly. Medical records? But surely Dr. Haydock would be the more appropriate person for such a task, given his longer acquaintance with the vicar's medical history. Dr. Haydock is visiting his daughter in Scotland for a fortnight. The inspector felt it couldn't wait. Dr. Pemberton shifted the package under his arm uncomfortably. I've been reviewing the prescriptions and treatment notes from the past several months. And you found something concerning? The vicar had been requesting stronger medication for his insomnia with increasing frequency. What troubled me more, however, was a prescription he requested last Tuesday for a rather large quantity of morphine. Said it was for a parishioner suffering from terminal cancer. But when I checked Dr. Haydock's records, I could find no such patient in the parish. This was indeed troubling information. Miss Marple filed it away carefully, adding it to the growing collection of anomalies surrounding Samuel Clement's final days. How very peculiar! Perhaps the patient was someone from outside the parish. Possibly, though it would be highly irregular for a vicar to involve himself in medical matters beyond his own congregation. Dr. Pemberton glanced at his watch. I must get back to the inspector. Good day, Miss Marple. After purchasing her stamps and engaging in the customary pleasantries with young Ethel, Miss Marple made her way slowly back towards the vicarage. The morning had grown warmer, and she was grateful for the shade of the old elm trees that lined Church Lane. She had not progressed far when she encountered Tom Bradley emerging from the side path that led from the church grounds to his cottage. The sexton looked thoroughly dishevelled, his face flushed and his hair askew, as though he had been engaged in some form of vigorous physical activity. Mr. Bradley, Miss Marple greeted him warmly. How nice to see you. I trust you're well. Tolerably, Miss Marple, tolerably. Bradley's responses were usually more expansive, and his current terseness struck her as significant. Busy morning, what with the police about and all. Yes, indeed. I imagine the inspector has been asking everyone about their observations Saturday evening. Bradley's eyes darted away from hers, focusing instead on the church spire, visible above the trees. Aye, he has that, though I can't say I was much help to him. Oh, I thought perhaps your discovery of the footprints and cigarette butts might have been quite valuable to the investigation. Well, yes, but he wanted to know about other things too, about the vicar's habits, his visitors, whether I'd noticed anything unusual recently. Bradley paused, then added reluctantly, he was particularly interested in the church safe. Miss Marple felt a small jolt of surprise. The church safe? How curious. Is there some concern about the contents? Chapter 4. Unexpected Visitors. But Tuesday afternoon, the investigation had taken an unexpected turn. Miss Marple learned of this development while taking tea with Mrs. Bantry, whose talent for extracting information from unlikely sources had proved invaluable during their previous encounters with criminal mysteries. Young Ethel at the post office told me the most extraordinary thing, Mrs. Bantry began, settling into her favourite armchair with evident relish. Apparently, 2 gentlemen arrived on the London train this morning, asking specifically about our missing vicar. They're staying at the Lamb and Flag, and George Lumsden says they have the look of official business about them." Miss Marple's teacup paused halfway to her lips. "Official business? From London? How intriguing." "That's not the most interesting part, dear Jane. According to George, and you know how observant he is, one of them was wearing a clerical collar, a clergyman from London coming to investigate our vicar's disappearance. Most unusual, wouldn't you say?" "Indeed, it was unusual." Miss Marple's experience with ecclesiastical hierarchy suggested that the Church typically handled internal matters with considerable discretion. For investigators to arrive from London so quickly implied something far more serious than a simple missing person case. Did Ethel mention anything else about these gentlemen? "Well, they spent considerable time on the telephone to London this morning. Long-distance calls," she said. "Quite expensive ones. And they've arranged to meet with Inspector Craddock this afternoon." Miss Marple set down her teacup and gazed thoughtfully out the window toward the church spire. "I believe I shall take a walk to the village this afternoon. These roses are positively demanding attention, and I noticed some lovely specimens in the Lamb and Flag's front garden." Mrs. Bantry smiled knowingly. "Of course, dear. Shall I join you? I've been meaning to inquire about their dinner menu for Sunday next." The Lamb and Flag stood at the far end of the High Street, its Tudor facade and hanging baskets creating a picture of rural tranquillity that belied its current significance as the temporary headquarters for mysterious London visitors. Miss Marple and Mrs. Bantry approached with the unhurried pace of ladies engaged in innocent afternoon exercise. They had barely begun their examination of the inn's thoroughly unremarkable rose garden when two men emerged from the main entrance. The first was indeed wearing a clerical collar beneath a well-tailored dark coat, a man of perhaps 50 with silver hair and the bearing of someone accustomed to authority. His companion, younger and decidedly more secular in appearance, carried a leather briefcase and wore the expression of a man conducting unpleasant business. Miss Marple bent to examine a climbing rose with unnecessary attention, positioning herself where she might observe without appearing to eavesdrop. "Rather more serious than we initially understood," the civilian was saying. "Inspector Craddock's preliminary findings suggest this goes considerably beyond simple financial irregularities. The morphine prescription alone is deeply troubling," replied the clergyman, his voice carrying the cultivated tones of an expensive education. "Combined with the other evidence, it paints a picture I find difficult to reconcile with Samuel's character." Miss Marple's fingers stilled on the rose stems. These men clearly knew far more about Samuel Clement's situation than they were revealing to the local investigation. "The question remains," continued the civilian, "whether he acted alone or was coerced. The timing suggests external pressure, but the methodology implies inside knowledge. Canon Weatherby will want a full report before we proceed with any official announcements," the clergyman said. "The reputation of the church must be considered naturally." At this moment, Inspector Craddock appeared from around the side of the building, having presumably arrived via the inn's rear entrance. His expression showed the particular strain of a man dealing with complications beyond his usual purview. "Gentlemen," he greeted them formally, "I trust your accommodations are satisfactory." "Perfectly adequate, thank you, Inspector," replied the clergyman. "I believe my colleague Mr. Patterson from the Ministry has some questions arising from Your initial investigations, Ministry. Miss Marple's interest sharpened considerably. Government involvement suggested matters far more complex than a country vicar's disappearance. The three men moved away toward Inspector Craddock's motor car, their conversation becoming inaudible. Miss Marple straightened, her mind already working through the implications of what she had overheard. "Well," whispered Mrs. Bantry as they retreated to a safer distance, "that certainly puts a different complexion on things. Canon Weatherby. I believe he's someone quite important at St. Albans Cathedral. And this Mr. Patterson from the Ministry," Miss Marple murmured. "There are several ministries that might take interest in a vicar's affairs, though none for entirely pleasant reasons." They were interrupted by the arrival of Tom Bradley, who appeared to be walking with unusual purpose toward the inn. His face showed signs of considerable agitation, and he kept glancing nervously over his shoulder as though expecting to be followed. "Mr. Bradley," Miss Marple called pleasantly. "How lovely to see you. Taking a stroll this fine afternoon?" Bradley started, visibly, then approached with obvious reluctance. "Miss Marple, Mrs. Bantry. Yes, well, I was that is to say—" He struggled for words, clearly distressed. "Nothing troubling, I hope?" Miss Marple's tone was gently encouraging. "It's those men from London," Bradley said in a rush. "They've been asking questions about the vicar's— about certain matters that aren't any of their business. Private parish business." "Oh dear," Mrs. Bantry said sympathetically. "How very distressing for you. They wanted to know about the church finances, about who had access to the safe, about the vicar's recent correspondence." Bradley's agitation increased. One of them even asked about the old crypt beneath the chancel. "Hasn't been used for storage in years." Miss Marple felt a small chill of premonition. The crypt. How very specific of them to ask. "Aye, that's what troubled me. How would London folk know about the crypt unless someone had told them? And why would they care about that particular part of the church?" Before anyone could respond to this excellent question, Dr. Pemberton rounded the corner, walking quickly and carrying what appeared to be a small, wrapped package. He nodded briefly to the group, but continued past without stopping, his face set in lines of professional concern. "Dr. Pemberton seems rather rushed," observed Mrs. Bantry. "Aye, he's been back and forth to the station all day," Bradley said, "sending telegrams by the look of it, to London most likely." This was indeed interesting. Dr. Pemberton's increased activity suggested he had discovered something significant in his examination of the medical records, something requiring urgent communication with outside authorities. "Mr. Bradley," Miss Marple said gently, "you mentioned the men from London asked about correspondence. I don't suppose the vicar received any unusual letters recently?" Bradley hesitated, clearly wrestling with some internal conflict. "Well," he said finally, "there was something. Friday morning, when I was tending the churchyard, I saw the vicar burning papers in his garden. Not usual for him. He typically kept everything filed proper-like. But there he was, burning what looked like a whole stack of letters." "Burning letters," Mrs. Bantry echoed. "How very odd." "Aye, and he seemed quite distressed about it. When he saw me watching, he came over and made some excuse about clearing out old parish correspondence. But the paper looked fresh, if you take my meaning, not yellowed with age. Miss Marple filed this information carefully. Samuel Clement burning correspondence on Friday morning. The same day he had received the mysterious visitor and had worked late in his study. The pattern suggested a man trying to eliminate evidence of something. But evidence of what? I don't. Suppose you noticed anything about the letters? The handwriting, perhaps, or the postmarks? Only caught a glimpse, Miss Marple, but I could have sworn I saw letterhead of some sort. Official-looking like. The three companions parted ways shortly afterward, Bradley heading home with obvious relief at having shared his burden of knowledge, while Miss Marple and Mrs. Bantry walked slowly back through the village centre. "Jane," Mrs. Bantry said as they paused beside the war memorial, "I have the most unsettling feeling about all this. A vicar who requests morphine for non-existent patients, burns official correspondence, and then disappears after someone searches his papers. It rather suggests—" "Yes, dear," Miss Marple agreed quietly, "it rather does. Though I suspect the truth may be even more complex than we imagine." As they reached Miss Marple's cottage, she noticed a small detail that made her pause. Dr. Pemberton's bicycle was propped against his garden gate, though she had seen him heading toward the station not 20 minutes earlier. Either he had returned, with remarkable speed, or— "Mrs. Bantry," she said slowly, "I believe I shall spend this evening reviewing everything we know about our missing vicar. Human nature being what it is, I suspect we've been looking at this mystery from entirely the wrong direction." The afternoon's revelations had added several new pieces to the puzzle, but Miss Marple was beginning to suspect that the solution lay not in what they were finding, but in what someone had been desperately trying to hide. The question was whether Samuel Clement had been the hidden party, or whether he had stumbled upon someone else's secret. Chapter 5. Hidden Depths. Wednesday morning brought an unusually heavy mist to Little Wickham, blanketing the village in a grey shroud that seemed to muffle both sound and movement. Miss Marple took advantage of the obscured visibility to conduct what she privately termed investigative gardening, tending to plants strategically positioned near areas of interest while maintaining the appearance of innocent domesticity. She had risen earlier than usual, troubled by a dream she could not quite remember, but which had left her with the persistent feeling that she was missing something obvious. As she worked among her delphiniums, she noticed movement at the vicarage. Through the mist, she could make out the unmistakable figure of Inspector Craddock emerging from the front door, accompanied by the London clergyman and Mr. Patterson. Three men stood in the garden, their voices carrying clearly in the damp morning air. "Absolutely certain about the dates?" Patterson was asking, his tone sharp with professional scepticism. "The prescription records are quite clear, Inspector," Craddock replied. Dr. Pemberton confirmed that Reverend Clement requested increasingly large quantities of morphine over the past 6 weeks, all supposedly for terminal cancer patients, who, according to medical records, simply don't exist. The London clergyman's voice carried obvious distress. Samuel was always scrupulously honest about parish matters. If he was acquiring morphine under false pretences, something must have been driving him to desperate measures. "The question," Patterson interjected coldly, "is whether those measures involved criminal behaviour, or whether he was being coerced. The pattern suggests someone with access to medical supplies and knowledge of proper procedures." Miss Marple paused in her weeding, her mind sharp with attention. The official nature of Patterson's language suggested government intelligence or security services, departments that would take interest in illegal drug acquisition, for reasons having nothing to do with simple addiction or medical malpractice. What about the safe deposit box in Much Benham? The clergyman asked. Have you been able to obtain a warrant? The bank has been cooperative, Craddock admitted. We'll examine the contents this afternoon, though I suspect, given the pattern of evidence destruction, we may find it empty. Safe deposit box? This was the first Miss Marple had heard of such a thing. Samuel Clement had never mentioned banking business beyond the weekly church deposits, yet apparently he had maintained private financial arrangements unknown to his congregation. The men moved toward a waiting motor car, their conversation becoming indistinct as they walked away. Miss Marple continued her gardening with renewed thoughtfulness, wondering what other secrets the apparently simple country vicar had been keeping. She was still contemplating this when Mrs. Bantry arrived, looking unusually flustered. Jane, the most extraordinary thing has happened. I've just come from the Lamb and Flag, where Mrs. Henderson was quite beside herself. It seems someone broke into her cottage last night, searched through all her private papers, just as they did to poor Samuel's study. Miss Marple's secateurs stilled in her hands. Mrs. Henderson, but she lives on Rosemary Lane, nearly half about out of a mile from the vicarage. What possible connection could she have to this business? That's exactly what I wondered, but apparently Mrs. Henderson has been helping with the church flower arrangements every Friday for the past month. She mentioned to Mrs. Wainwright that she'd been staying late to help the vicar with some special project involving historical research. Historical research. Miss Marple felt the familiar tingle of important information falling into place. Did she elaborate on the nature of this research? She was quite vague about it, but she did mention that it involved some old documents the vicar had discovered in the crypt. Documents that apparently had some bearing on wartime activities in the parish. Wartime activities. The crypt. Morphine acquisition. The pieces were beginning to form a pattern that made Miss Marple distinctly uneasy. During the war, Little Wickham had been used as a staging area for various military operations, and the church had served multiple functions beyond its spiritual role. Mrs. Bantry, Miss Marple said carefully, I believe we need to pay a visit to Mrs. Henderson. Her memory of these historical documents may be quite valuable. Mrs. Henderson lived in a neat cottage surrounded by an impressive collection of garden, gnomes and elaborate topiary. When Miss Marple and Mrs. Bantry arrived, they found her in her front room, surrounded by scattered papers and looking thoroughly shaken. Oh, Miss Marple, Mrs. Bantry, how kind of you to call. I'm afraid I'm quite at 6s and 7s after last night. Mrs. Henderson gestured helplessly at the chaos around her. They were very neat about it, I'll give them that. Nothing broken, nothing missing as far as I can tell, but they went through everything, every drawer, every cupboard. How terrifying for you, Mrs. Bantry sympathized. Did you see anything of the intruders? Nothing at all. I take a sleeping draught, you see, because of my arthritis. Didn't hear a thing until this morning when I came downstairs to find this mess. Miss Marple settled herself in the offered chair, noting the methodical nature of the search. I understand you'd been helping Reverend Clement with some historical research. Mrs. Henderson's face brightened slightly. Oh, yes, such fascinating work. Samuel had discovered some old papers in the church crypt, documents that had been sealed up since the war, quite by accident, really. Tom Bradley was doing some work on the heating system and noticed a loose stone that revealed a hidden compartment. How intriguing. What sort of documents? Military correspondence, mainly. Lists of names, supply records, movement orders. Samuel thought they might be valuable for the parish history he'd been planning to write. We'd been cataloguing them every Friday evening. Miss Marple exchanged a meaningful glance with Mrs. Bantry. And these documents were kept where? Samuel had them locked in his study safe, along with photocopies I'd made. We were being very careful with the originals, you understand. Some of them were quite fragile. I don't suppose you remember any specific details about the contents. Mrs. Henderson looked thoughtful. Well, there were several lists of local residents who'd provided assistance during the war. Safe houses, supply drops, that sort of thing. And there was one very interesting document. A report about German agents who'd been captured in this area in 1943. Miss Marple felt her pulse quicken. German agents captured in Little Wickham during the war would certainly explain governmental interest in documents that had recently been discovered. It would also explain why someone might be desperate to acquire those documents now, particularly if they contained names or information that could compromise people still living. Was there any mention of what happened to these agents? She asked carefully. Oh, yes, that was the most interesting part. According to the report, one of them was never found. He'd been working under deep cover for months before his associates were captured, and the authorities suspected he'd gone to ground somewhere in the local area. Samuel was quite fascinated by it all, kept saying it would make an excellent addition to the parish historical records. Mrs. Bantry looked puzzled, but surely that was all so long ago. Why would anyone care about such old spy stories now? Mrs. Henderson shrugged. Samuel had the same thought initially, but then that gentleman visited him last week, the one with the motorcycle. Samuel seemed quite different after that conversation. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. Different? In what way? Worried, I'd say. Even frightened, perhaps. He asked me not to mention our research project to anyone. Said it might be sensitive in ways we hadn't considered. After that, he started working on the documents himself, without my help, and the night of his disappearance, he telephoned me that Saturday afternoon, asked if I'd made copies of everything. When I said yes, he seemed relieved, but also more anxious than before. Said I should lock my copies away safely, and not discuss them with anyone until he returned. The Einbauer pattern was becoming clearer. Someone had known about the wartime documents and their potential significance. The mysterious motorcyclist's visit had triggered Samuel's realization of danger, leading to the burning of correspondence, the late night, work sessions, and ultimately his disappearance. Mrs. Henderson, Miss Marple said gently, I don't suppose you still have those photocopies. Mrs. Henderson's face fell. I'm afraid not. They were kept in my writing desk. That's what the intruders were most interested in, I'm sure. The desk was completely ransacked, and those particular papers are the only thing I can identify as definitely missing. As Miss Marple and Mrs. Bantry took their leave, promising to check on Mrs. Henderson again soon, Miss Marple's mind was working rapidly through the implications of what they'd learned. A missing German agent from 1943. Wartime documents discovered in the church crypt. A mysterious visitor who had somehow learned of these documents and their significance, and now both the vicar and the documents had disappeared. Miss Marple was beginning to suspect that Samuel Clement's disappearance had very little to do with morphine prescriptions or financial irregularities, and everything to do with secrets that someone had spent 30 years believing safely buried in the past. The question now was whether the vicar had been silenced to protect those secrets, or whether he had discovered something that had forced him into hiding for his own protection. Chapter 6. The Doctor's Dilemma. Thursday morning found Miss Marple in her kitchen, brewing a particularly strong pot of tea and contemplating the curious behaviour of Dr. Nicholas Pemberton. Through her window, she could observe the young doctor's cottage, where an unusual amount of activity had been taking place since dawn. Twice she had seen him emerge with packages, only to return shortly afterward empty-handed, his face bearing an expression of increasing agitation. The telephone rang at precisely 9 o'clock, interrupting her observations. Mrs. Bantry's voice carried an unusual note of urgency. "Jane, you must come at once. Inspector Craddock has just arrested Tom Bradley. They took him away not 20 minutes ago, and the whole village is in an absolute uproar." Miss Marple set down her teacup with deliberate care. "Arrested Tom? On what charges?" "No one seems quite certain. Constable Lumsden mentioned something about withholding information relevant to the investigation, but there's talk of more serious charges pending. Poor Mrs. Bradley is beside herself. I shall be there directly," Miss Marple assured her, already reaching for her hat. As she prepared to leave, she noticed Dr. Pemberton hurrying toward the church with yet another package, his movements betraying a man under considerable stress. The village green had become an impromptu gathering place, with clusters of residents discussing the morning's dramatic developments in hushed, urgent tones. Miss Marple found Mrs. Bantry near the War Memorial, deep in conversation with Miss Croft and the three Mrs. Skinner. "The poor man looked absolutely terrified," Miss Croft was saying, her voice trembling with sympathy. "When they marched him out in handcuffs, he kept protesting that he'd told them everything he knew." "Everything he knew about what, though?" interjected the eldest Miss Skinner. "That's what I'd like to understand. What could our quiet church sexton possibly know that warranted such dramatic action?" Mrs. Bantry spotted Miss Marple and approached with evident relief. "Oh, Jane, thank goodness you're here. This whole business has taken such a sinister turn." Major Burnaby spoke with Inspector Craddock briefly, and apparently Tom had been hiding something significant about Saturday night. What sort of something? Well, it seems Tom wasn't entirely truthful about his whereabouts that evening. He claimed he'd gone home after evening prayers, but apparently someone saw him near the vicarage garden much later, around the time Mrs. Pollock heard the gate creak. Miss Marple absorbed this information thoughtfully. "I see, and this witness has only now come forward. That's the peculiar thing. According to Mrs. Wainwright, it was Dr. Pemberton who provided this information. He told Inspector Craddock he'd seen Tom in the vicarage garden when he was returning from a late house call. This gave Miss Marple considerable pause. Dr. Pemberton had previously said nothing about seeing Tom Bradley that evening, despite multiple opportunities to share such crucial information. Why had he remained silent until now? "Mrs. Bantry," she said quietly, "I believe I should like to have a word with Dr. Pemberton. Professional ethics aside, his timing seems rather convenient." They made their way to Dr. Pemberton's cottage, finding it in an unusually dishevelled state. Medical journals were scattered about the front room, and several packing boxes suggested preparation for departure. The doctor himself appeared when, They knocked, looking haggard and distinctly unwelcome. "Miss Marple, Mrs. Bantry, I'm afraid I'm rather busy this morning. Is there some medical emergency?" "Nothing urgent, Dr. Pemberton," Miss Marple replied pleasantly. "Though I did wonder if you might clarify something. I understand you witnessed Tom Bradley near the vicarage on Saturday evening." Dr. Pemberton's composure slipped noticeably. "Yes, well, I thought it best to report what I'd observed once the investigation became more serious. Of course, though, I'm curious why you didn't mention this significant detail earlier. You've had several opportunities to share such information." "I wasn't certain of the time, couldn't be sure it was relevant," he said, his eyes avoiding their direct gaze. But when they began asking more specific questions about Tom's movements, Mrs. Bantry stepped forward slightly. "Dr. Pemberton, forgive my asking, but are you planning a journey? Your home seems prepared for departure." "A conference in London," he replied quickly. "Medical research. I'll be away for several weeks, perhaps longer." Miss Marple noted the packed boxes with interest. "How sudden! I hope this conference wasn't planned in response to recent events." Dr. Pemberton's anxiety became more pronounced. "Not at all, though I admit this whole business with the vicar has been disturbing. I feel perhaps a change of scene would be beneficial." "Quite understandable," Miss Marple agreed sympathetically. "These investigations can be terribly stressful, especially when one discovers troubling medical irregularities. Dr. Haydock mentioned you'd found some concerning patterns in Reverend Clement's prescriptions." "I've shared all relevant information with the authorities," Dr. Pemberton said stiffly. "Patient confidentiality prevents me from discussing specific details. Naturally, though I imagine the requests for morphine must have been particularly troubling, given that the supposed patients appear not to have existed." Dr. Pemberton's face went very pale. "How did you— that is, I'm not sure what you mean." Miss Marple tilted her head slightly, her expression remaining gentle. "Oh, forgive me. I assumed it was common knowledge by now. Inspector Craddock mentioned it yesterday when he was discussing the case with those gentlemen from London." "Gentlemen from London?" Dr. Pemberton's voice carried a note of sharp alarm. "Yes, dear. A clergyman and someone from the ministry. They seemed particularly interested in the medical aspects of the case. I believe they were planning to review all relevant prescriptions and medical records." Dr. Pemberton moved behind his desk, his hands trembling slightly as he shuffled papers. "I see. Well, as I said, I've been fully cooperative with the investigation." "I'm sure you have," Miss Marple said warmly, "though I confess I've been puzzling. Over something? These morphine prescriptions, they were written over several weeks, weren't they? Yet according to Mrs. Henderson, the vicar only became particularly concerned after that mysterious visitor arrived last Friday." "I wouldn't know about any visitor," Dr. Pemberton replied tersely. "Oh, but surely you would. Tom Bradley mentioned seeing a motorcycle twice on Friday, morning and evening, and Mrs. Pollock described it as red and black, quite distinctive. I believe you own a red and black motorcycle, don't you, Dr. Pemberton?" The silence that followed stretched uncomfortably. Dr. Pemberton's face had gone from pale to ashen, and his hands had stilled completely on the papers before him. "I think," he said finally, "you're making assumptions that could be quite dangerous. Miss Marple, dangerous? Oh, my dear man, I'm simply an elderly lady trying to understand what happened to our poor vicar. Though I do wonder, If you were the Friday visitor, what could have been so urgent as to require 2 visits in one day?" Dr. Pemberton stood abruptly, moving to the window that faced the church. "The vicar was a troubled man, Miss Marple. More troubled than anyone realized. Sometimes people in desperate circumstances make arrangements that seem reasonable at the time, but later appear quite damaging." "Arrangements? You mean the morphine, among other things?" He turned back to face them, his expression now showing a curious mixture of defiance and resignation. Samuel Clement was not the simple country parson he appeared to be. He had obligations, debts of honour that went back many years. Wars leave many kinds of scars, Miss Marple, not all of them visible. Mrs. Bantry looked puzzled, but Miss Marple felt pieces clicking into place with sudden clarity. "Dr. Pemberton, were you born in this area?" "Near enough. My family had connections to Little Wickham during the war." "I see. And these connections, they involved the resistance activities that were coordinated through the church." Dr. Pemberton's laugh was bitter. "You really are quite perceptive, aren't you?" "Yes, my father worked with the local resistance networks, helped coordinate supply drops, maintained safe houses, aided in the capture of German agents." "Aided in their capture? Or aided some of them in avoiding capture?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Dr. Pemberton stared at Miss Marple for a long moment, as though weighing his options. "Miss Marple," he said quietly, "there are some secrets that are better left buried. Samuel understood that. He was trying to protect people, not expose them." "Protect people? Or protect someone in particular?" Before Dr. Pemberton could respond, the sound of motors outside drew their attention to the window. Inspector Craddock's car was pulling up, followed by a second vehicle containing the London officials. "It seems," Dr. Pemberton said with forced calm, "that our conversation will have to be continued at another time." But as Miss Marple watched the young doctor's face, she realized with growing certainty that the truth about Samuel Clement's disappearance was far more complex than anyone had imagined. The missing vicar, the mysterious documents, the morphine prescriptions, and Dr. Pemberton's own secrets were all connected by invisible threads that led back to wartime events no one was supposed to remember. Chapter 7. Revelations at Tea Time. The arrival of Inspector Craddock and the London officials cut short any further conversation with Dr. Pemberton, though Miss Marple noted with interest the look of resignation that crossed his face as he watched them approach. She and Mrs. Bantry took their leave gracefully, but not before Miss Marple observed the doctor hastily sliding several papers into his desk drawer. Papers that had been prominently displayed moments before. "Jane," Mrs. Bantry whispered as they walked away, "I have the distinct feeling we interrupted something rather important." "Indeed, dear. Dr. Pemberton was on the verge of saying something quite significant when we were interrupted. Most inconvenient timing." They had barely reached the village green when young Ethel from the post office came running toward them, her face flushed with excitement and what appeared to be considerable distress. "Miss Marple, Mrs. Bantry! Oh, I'm so glad to find you. I've just had the most dreadful telephone call, and I don't know what to do about it." Miss Marple guided the agitated girl to the bench near the war memorial. "Sit down, dear, and tell us what's happened. It was from Mrs. Clement, the vicar's sister. She's coming back from Much Benham this afternoon, and asked me to arrange for someone to meet her at the station. But that's not the strange part." Ethel paused to catch her breath. "She said she'd found something in Samuel's safe deposit box. Something that explains everything about his disappearance. She sounded terrified, Miss Marple. Absolutely terrified." Mrs. Bantry leaned forward intently. "Did she say what she'd found?" "Not exactly, but she kept saying something about Father's old journals, and how Samuel had been right to hide them. She said she needed to speak with someone she could trust before the authorities found out." Miss Marple felt a familiar tingle of significance. Father's journals, another connection to the wartime period that kept emerging in this case. Did she mention who she wished to speak with? That's the peculiar thing. She asked specifically for you, Miss Marple, said Samuel had mentioned you as someone who understood people and could be trusted with delicate matters. She'll be on the 3 o'clock train from Mudge Benham. This was indeed unexpected. Miss Marple had spoken with Mrs. Clement only briefly during her tenure in Little Wickham, and never about anything more substantial than parish business. That Samuel had spoken of her to his sister suggested he had been considering sharing his burden with someone. Perhaps he had intended to confide in her before circumstances forced his disappearance. "Of course I'll meet her," Miss Marple said, "though I think perhaps you should also inform Inspector Craddock of Mrs. Clement's return." Ethel looked uncertain. "She specifically said not to tell the police until she'd spoken with you. She seemed quite insistent about that." After Ethel had hurried back to her duties, Miss Marple and Mrs. Bantry walked slowly toward home, both lost in thought. The implications of Mrs. Clement's discovery were substantial. If Samuel's father had kept wartime journals, they might contain information about the missing German agent, the resistance activities, and the secrets that had apparently motivated someone to search so desperately for the recently discovered documents. "Jane," Mrs. Bantry said as they reached Miss Marple's garden gate, "I've been thinking about Dr. Pemberton's family connections. If his father was involved in wartime resistance work, and if there really was a German agent who was never captured—" "Yes, dear, I suspect you're thinking what I'm thinking. The question is whether Dr. Pemberton's family helped in the capture of enemy agents, or whether they helped certain agents avoid capture entirely." They were interrupted by the approach of Major Burnaby, his military bearing evident even in his obvious agitation. "Miss Marple," he called, slightly out of breath, "I wonder if I might have a word. There's been a rather disturbing development regarding young Bradley's arrest." Miss Marple invited both the Major and Mrs. Bantry into her sitting room, where she prepared tea with the practised efficiency of someone who recognized the value of a proper cup of tea in facilitating difficult conversations. "The thing is," Major Burnaby began, settling into his chair with evident discomfort, "I fear I may have contributed to Bradley's predicament through my own carelessness." "Oh dear, how so, Major?" "You see, I was the one who told Inspector Craddock about Dr. Pemberton seeing Bradley in the vicarage garden Saturday night, but I realize now that I may have misunderstood what the doctor actually said." Miss Marple set down her teacup carefully. "Perhaps you could clarify what Dr. Pemberton actually told you." "Well, we were discussing the investigation yesterday evening, and Pemberton mentioned that he'd been concerned about Bradley's mental state since the vicar's disappearance. He said something about Bradley being where he shouldn't have been and looking guilty about something. I assumed he meant Saturday night, but thinking back, I'm not certain he specified the time at all. Mrs. Bantry frowned. So, Dr. Pemberton might not have seen Tom in the vicarage garden on Saturday evening. Exactly. And when I mentioned this to the inspector, suggesting Pemberton was a witness to Bradley's presence there Saturday night, the doctor didn't correct me. In fact, he seemed almost relieved that I'd interpreted his words that way. Miss Marple found this revelation most illuminating. Major Burnaby, did Dr. Pemberton ask you to speak with Inspector Craddock about this matter? Not in so many words, but he made sure to have the conversation where I'd overhear, if you take my meaning, almost as though he wanted me to draw that conclusion and act upon it. How very interesting. And Tom Bradley, had you noticed him acting guilty about anything recently? Major Burnaby shifted uncomfortably. Well, yes, actually, for the past several weeks he's seemed quite preoccupied. I've seen him working in the church at odd hours, and he's been rather secretive about maintenance projects that normally he'd discuss quite openly. Miss Marple absorbed this information while pouring fresh tea. The picture emerging was of Dr. Pemberton deliberately deflecting suspicion onto Tom Bradley while concealing his own involvement with the vicar's affairs. But what role had Tom actually played in recent events, Major? She said gently. I don't. Suppose you've noticed Tom Bradley exhibiting any particular expertise beyond his usual sexton duties? Funny you should ask. My late wife used to say Tom was wasted in his current position. During the war, he'd been a wireless operator, quite skilled with mechanical and electrical equipment, always tinkering with radios and such. Exter. Wireless operator. Miss Marple filed this detail away with growing interest. Wireless operators during the war had been crucial for communication with resistance networks and for coordinating clandestine operations. Before she could pursue this line of inquiry further, Constable Lumsden appeared at her front door, looking thoroughly flustered. Begging your pardon, Miss Marple, but Inspector Craddock asked me to find you. There's been a development with Dr. Pemberton. Oh dear. What sort of development? Well, miss, it seems the doctor has disappeared. His cottage is empty, no sign of where he's gone. And the London gentlemen are quite agitated about it. They're saying he may have taken important evidence with him. Miss Marple was not entirely surprised by this news, though the timing was unfortunate. When was his disappearance discovered? Not an hour ago. The inspector went to question him further about his late testimony regarding Bradley, only to find the place deserted. Looks like he left in quite a hurry, left food on the table and the door unlocked. Mrs. Bantry looked alarmed. But surely he can't have gone far. There are only so many ways to leave Little Wickham. That's just it, Mrs. Bantry. His motorcycle is still in the garage, and no one saw him leave by motor car. It's as though he simply vanished. Miss Marple stood and moved to her window, gazing toward the church and the surrounding countryside. 2 people had now disappeared from Little Wickham within a week, both connected to wartime secrets that someone had apparently killed to protect or expose. Constable Lumsden, she said thoughtfully, I don't suppose the inspector has considered searching the church itself. In my experience, the best hiding places are often in the most obvious locations. The constable looked uncertain. I'll mention it to him, miss. Though I should tell you, he wants to speak with you before Mrs. Clement arrives this afternoon. Says there are questions about how she knew to contact you specifically. As Constable Lumsden departed, Miss Marple realized that events were accelerating beyond anyone's control. Whatever Samuel Clement had discovered in those wartime documents had set in motion a chain of events that would not stop until the truth was finally revealed. The question now was whether that truth would emerge through official investigation, or through the desperate actions of someone willing to commit murder to keep 30-year-old secrets buried. Chapter 8. Mrs. Clement's Burden. The 3 o'clock train from Much Benham arrived with unusual punctuality, though Miss Marple noticed it carried fewer passengers than typical for a Thursday afternoon. From her position on the station platform, she could see Mrs. Clement before the train had fully stopped. A tall, angular woman clutching a leather satchel with both hands, her sharp features etched with unmistakable fear. Inspector Craddock had insisted on accompanying Miss Marple to the station, along with Mr. Patterson from the ministry, though Miss Marple had managed to persuade them to wait in the station-master's office rather than on the platform itself. Mrs. Clement, she argued, was more likely to speak freely without the immediate pressure of official presence. Miss Marple. Mrs. Clement's greeting was terse, her voice barely above a whisper. "Thank you for coming. I wasn't certain you would." "Of course, dear. Your brother spoke of you often. I'm terribly sorry about his disappearance." Mrs. Clement's face crumpled momentarily before she regained control. "He's not disappeared, Miss Marple. He's dead. I'm quite certain of it now." She clutched the satchel more tightly. "And it's all because of these damn journals and the secrets father could never leave alone." Miss Marple guided her to a bench, away from the station building, where they could speak more privately. "Perhaps you'd like to tell me what you discovered in Samuel's safe deposit box." "It wasn't just what I found there. It was what I remembered afterward." Mrs. Clement opened the satchel with trembling hands, revealing 2 worn leather-bound journals and several manila folders. Father's wartime journals, as I told the post office girl, but also correspondence Samuel had been hiding, and most importantly, a translation he'd been working on. A translation! One of the wartime documents from the church crypt was in German. Samuel had been teaching himself the language specifically to translate it properly. Mrs. Clement withdrew a typewritten page covered with corrections and annotations. "This document, Miss Marple, contained intelligence about a German agent named Klaus Weber, who had successfully infiltrated our resistance networks in 1943. Miss Marple felt the familiar chill of approaching revelation. And this Weber, was he the agent who was never captured? According to Father's journals, Weber wasn't captured because he was being protected. Someone in our resistance network had been feeding information to the Germans, and Weber was their primary contact. Father suspected a local collaborator, but could never prove it. Mrs. Clement paused to compose herself, her hands shaking as she turned pages in one of the journals. The terrible thing is, Father's suspicions focused on the Pemberton family. Mr. Pemberton, the current doctor's father, had access to all resistance communications as one of the wireless coordinators. Father believed he had been compromised, possibly through coercion involving his family. Dr. Pemberton's father was suspected of collaboration. Worse than that, Father's final entry suggests he confronted Mr. Pemberton directly. This was in late 1943, shortly before Father's death, in what was officially classified as an accidental fall from the church tower while inspecting storm damage. Miss Marple absorbed this information with growing understanding. And Samuel translated this evidence recently? last month, when those documents were discovered in the crypt. He'd been excited about the historical value until he realized what they actually contained. That's when he started receiving the letters. Letters? Mrs. Clement withdrew an envelope from the folder. Unsigned but clearly threatening. All variations of the same message. Some secrets should stay buried. Consider your family's safety. Miss Marple examined the envelope, noting the London postmark and the expensive paper, and these arrived after Samuel began his translation work. The first one came the day after he told Mrs. Henderson about the German agent document. Someone was watching his research very carefully. The pattern was becoming clearer. Someone with knowledge of the wartime events had been monitoring the situation, perhaps for years, waiting to ensure that damaging evidence remained hidden. The discovery of the crypt documents had triggered a response that had ultimately cost Samuel his life. "Mrs. Clement," Miss Marple said gently, "I believe Samuel may have confided in Dr. Pemberton about these discoveries. The young doctor visited him twice last Friday." Mrs. Clement's face showed sudden understanding. Of course, Samuel mentioned being troubled about inherited obligations. He said some people couldn't escape their family's wartime choices, no matter how much they wanted. True. Did he elaborate on that? He said young Dr. Pemberton had been trying to make amends for his father's actions during the war. Apparently, the doctor had been providing Samuel with medical supplies, morphine specifically, for some charitable work Samuel was doing quietly. Miss Marple felt another piece click into place. Charitable work, not illegal drug distribution. Heavens, no! Samuel had been helping terminal patients who couldn't afford proper pain medication. He developed a small network of people in need funded from his own savings. Dr. Pemberton had been helping by providing legitimate prescriptions under different names. This revelation cast the morphine acquisitions in an entirely different light. Rather than criminal activity, it had been an act of mercy that Dr. Pemberton had facilitated as a form of atonement for his father's wartime actions. But the threatening letters, Miss Marple prompted. Samuel became convinced that someone wanted him to stop his translation work entirely. When he refused and continued cataloguing the documents with Mrs. Henderson, the letters became more specific. They mentioned exact details about his charitable work with the morphine, suggesting the writer had been watching him closely. Mrs. Clement's voice dropped even lower. The final letter arrived last Thursday. It said simply, "Weber is still alive. Some people never really die. Stop digging up the past or join your father." Miss Marple felt a chill run down her spine. The missing German agent, Klaus Weber, was still alive and apparently willing to kill to protect his identity and his wartime collaborators. Mrs. Clement, did Samuel share any suspicions about who might be sending these letters? He'd become convinced it was someone local, someone who had been watching the village all these years, someone who knew about Father's journals, about the recent discoveries, about Samuel's every move. Mrs. Clement paused, seeming to gather her courage. "Miss Marple, there's something else. Something I didn't tell the authorities. Yes, Saturday morning, before he disappeared, Samuel left a message with Mrs. Henderson. He said if anything happened to him, she should tell someone trustworthy to search the church organ. He'd hidden something there, something that would expose the truth about Weber and the collaborator." Miss Marple's mind raced. Tom Bradley, with his mechanical expertise, would have ready access to the church organ and could easily hide or retrieve items from within its complex machinery. Before she could pursue this thought further, Inspector Craddock emerged from the station building, his patience evidently exhausted. "Mrs. Clement, I must insist we continue this conversation at the police station. There are official matters that require immediate attention." Mrs. Clement looked imploringly at Miss Marple. "There's one more thing. Samuel's final note in his appointment book, written Friday night. The wolf has been among the sheep for 30 years, but tomorrow I'll expose the truth. God forgive me for what this will cost others." As Inspector Craddock escorted Mrs. Clement away, Miss Marple remained on the station platform, processing everything she had learned. Klaus Weber, the German agent, was alive and still in Little Wickham. Someone had been protecting his identity for 30 years. Someone with deep knowledge of village life and access to information about Samuel's research. Dr. Pemberton's disappearance now made perfect sense. He had either been silenced because he knew too much, or he had fled because his family's wartime secrets were about to be exposed. But the key to everything lay in the church organ, where Samuel had hidden his final piece of evidence. Miss Marple began walking slowly back toward the village, her mind working through the implications. She had a growing suspicion about the identity of Klaus Weber's protector, but confirmation would require a careful examination of the church organ, assuming Tom Bradley's arrest wasn't connected to his knowledge of what Samuel had hidden there. She reached the village green. Miss Marple noticed unusual activity around the church. Several official vehicles were parked outside, and men in plain clothes were conducting what appeared to be a thorough search of the building. Someone else, it seemed, had also realized the significance of Samuel's final clue. The question now was whether they would find what Samuel had hidden before Miss Marple could determine the truth about Little Wickham's 30-year-old secret. Chapter 9. The Organ's Secret Miss. Marple approached the church with the careful deliberation of someone who understood that timing could mean the difference between exposure and tragedy. The official search was methodical but noisy, with Inspector Craddock and the London officials directing uniformed constables through every corner of the ancient building. From her vantage point behind the lich gate, she could observe their activities while remaining unnoticed. They had clearly started with the crypt, no doubt prompted by Mrs. Clement's revelations about the hidden documents. The sounds of heavy footsteps echoed from below, accompanied by the scraping of stone and the occasional muffled exclamation, "Rather like watching an archaeological dig," observed a familiar voice beside her. Miss Marple turned to find Mrs. Bantry, who had approached with the practised stealth of someone accustomed to observing village dramas from discreet distances. "Indeed, dear, though I suspect they're looking in entirely the wrong place. The organ, precisely. Though with all this official activity, accessing it presents certain challenges." Mrs. Bantry glanced around, noting the constables posted at the various church entrances. What about the vestry door? Tom Bradley mentioned footprints there Saturday evening. There might be another way in through the choir loft. Miss Marple considered this suggestion with growing interest. The vestry connected to the choir area behind the organ console. And in churches of St. Bartholomew's vintage, there were often maintenance passages that provided access to the organ's internal mechanisms. An excellent suggestion, though I believe we should wait until they've finished with the crypt. Patience, as I've often found, is a virtue particularly valuable in matters of detection. Their patience was rewarded sooner than expected. Within the hour, the search party emerged from the church looking distinctly frustrated. Inspector Craddock's expression suggested they had found little of value, while Mr. Patterson appeared to be engaged in a heated telephone conversation with London. Nothing of significance in the crypt, Craddock was telling the London clergyman. Historical documents, old parish records, but no sign of recent activity or the materials Mrs. Clement described. Someone's been there before us, Patterson concluded, snapping his telephone closed. The question is whether it was Clement himself removing evidence before his disappearance, or someone else who knew where to look. Miss Marple watched as the officials gathered around Craddock's motor car, clearly debating their next move. This seemed an opportune moment to suggest a different approach. "Inspector Craddock," she called pleasantly, approaching the group with Mrs. Bantry. "Forgive the interruption, but I couldn't help noticing you've been searching the crypt. Might I suggest you haven't yet examined the organ?" Craddock looked up from his consultation with obvious irritation. "Miss Marple, this is official police business. I must ask you to—" "Of course, Inspector. Though young Dr. Pemberton mentioned to me yesterday that Samuel had been having trouble with the organ mechanism recently. Asked him about the noise it had been making during services." Patterson stepped forward. His interest sharpened. "What sort of noise?" "Mechanical grinding, according to Dr. Pemberton. Samuel thought something might have come loose in the bellows mechanism. Now, with Tom Bradley in custody, there's no one available who understands the organ's internal workings well enough to check properly." This was not entirely truthful, but Miss Marple had observed that official investigations often required gentle guidance toward the obvious. The London clergyman looked thoughtful. "Inspector, church organs are notoriously complex mechanisms. If Reverend Clement did hide something, the internal chamber of the organ would be an excellent choice. Accessible to someone with the right knowledge, but invisible to casual inspection." 20 minutes later, Miss Marple found herself accompanying Inspector Craddock and Mr. Patterson into the dark recesses behind the organ console. The vestry door, as she had suspected, provided access to a narrow maintenance passage that ran along the back of the organ pipes. The passage was cramped and dusty, clearly not intended for regular human occupancy. But as they progressed deeper into the mechanism, following the beam of Inspector Craddock's electric torch, Miss Marple began to notice signs of recent disturbance. Displaced dust, a dropped button from someone's coat, and most tellingly, the faint scent of cigarettes lingering in the stale air. "Someone's definitely been here recently," Craddock muttered, playing his light across the complex arrangement of pipes and mechanisms. "Inspector," Miss Marple called softly, "I believe you should examine this area more carefully." She had stopped beside a large access panel near the main bellows chamber. Unlike the other components, this panel showed obvious signs of recent opening. Scratches around the screws, disturbed dust patterns, and what appeared to be fresh tool marks on the metal. Patterson reached the panel first, producing a small toolkit from his coat with practiced efficiency. As he removed the screws, Miss Marple noted that his movements showed familiarity with such mechanisms, unusual for a ministry official unless his background included technical training. The panel swung open to reveal a cavity that had clearly been modified for concealment. Instead of the expected organ components, they found a metal document box secured with a simple padlock. "Well," said Inspector Craddock grimly, "I'd say we've found Reverend Clement's hiding place." Patterson made quick work of the padlock, though. Miss Marple noticed he used tools that seemed rather more sophisticated than a simple toolkit would normally contain. Inside the box, they discovered a collection of items that immediately clarified the scope of Samuel Clement's final investigation. There were photocopies of the German documents, Samuel's complete translation notes, photographs of what appeared to be wartime wireless equipment, and most significantly, a detailed map of Little Wickham, marked with various locations and dates from 1943. But it was the final item that made Miss Marple catch her breath. A small leather journal, clearly Samuel's own, with entries dating from the past month, detailing his growing understanding of the wartime conspiracy and its present-day implications. Patterson was already photographing the documents with a small camera, working with professional efficiency that confirmed Miss Marple's growing suspicions about his true role in the investigation. "Inspector," she said carefully, "might I suggest you examine Samuel's journal? I believe his final entries may provide insights that the historical documents alone cannot." Craddock picked up the journal and began reading aloud from the final entries. March 15th. Translation complete. Father was right about Pemberton, but the collaboration went deeper than suspected. Weber didn't just receive information. He recruited others, created a network that survived the war. March 18th. Confronted young Pemberton about his father's activities. He's been trying to make amends, knows more than he's admitted. Says the network is still active, still dangerous. March 20th. Someone's been watching my research. Henderson's house searched. They're getting desperate. March 22nd. Final confirmation. Weber assumed a new identity after the war, but never left the area. Has been living among us for 30 years. The wolf really has been among the sheep. God, help me, but I know who he is. The journal ended there, with no indication of Weber's current identity. But Miss Marple had noticed something the others had missed. Several pages had been carefully torn out, leaving only ragged edges as evidence of their former presence. "Someone's been here before us," she observed quietly. "The crucial pages have been removed." Patterson's face showed grim satisfaction rather than disappointment. "Perhaps, but we may have enough to proceed nonetheless." Inspector Craddock was examining the map when a thought occurred to Miss Marple. "Inspector, I notice this map shows wireless positions from 1943. During the war, Tom Bradley was a wireless operator. I wonder if his arrest was connected to his knowledge of these locations rather than his presence at the vicarage Saturday night." Before anyone could respond to this observation, they heard rapid footsteps in the church proper, followed by urgent voices. Constable Lumsden appeared at the vestry door, his face flushed with exertion. "Inspector! Sir! You need to come quickly. We've had a sighting of Dr. Pemberton. He's been spotted near the old mill. But that's not the urgent bit." "What is it, Constable?" "Tom Bradley, sir. He's escaped from custody. The sergeant at Much Benham says he picked the lock of his cell. Apparently he had skills they didn't know about. He's been gone for over an hour." Miss Marple felt a chill of premonition. Tom Bradley, with his knowledge of the organ's mechanisms, his wartime wireless experience, and his apparent involvement in Samuel's research, was now free and presumably desperate. "Inspector," she said urgently. "I fear we may have found the evidence too late. If Tom Bradley knew about this hiding place, and if he's been compromised by the same people who threatened Samuel—" She didn't need to finish the thought. In her experience, when conspiracies that had lasted 30 years began to unravel, the participants often chose violent solutions to protect their secrets. Seems someone had attempted to open it. Scratches around the lock mechanism, though they hadn't succeeded. The inspector thinks it might be connected to the break-in at the vicarage. This added yet another layer to the mystery. Someone had been looking for something specific, first in the vicar's study, then in the church safe. Both searches appeared to have been conducted by someone with limited skill in such matters, given that the study searcher had left obvious signs of their presence, and the safe remained intact. "I don't suppose you know what's typically kept in the church safe?" Miss Marple inquired delicately. Bradley shifted his weight from foot to foot, clearly uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation. "Historical documents, mostly. The original parish records, some valuable communion plate, insurance papers, and—" He hesitated. "Yes?" "Well, the vicar kept the collection money there over weekends sometimes, when he hadn't had a chance to get to the bank. Though that's not supposed to be general knowledge. Miss Marple absorbed this information with interest. Collection money would certainly provide a motive for attempted theft, though it seemed an unlikely reason for a systematic search of private papers or a vicar's disappearance." "Inspector Craddock must be considering all possibilities," she observed, diplomatically. "Aye, he is that. Asked me specifically about Friday evening, whether I'd seen anyone about the church or vicarage after hours. Had to tell him I hadn't seen anything unusual, though." Bradley trailed off. "Though what, Mr. Bradley?" "Well, I did hear that motorcycle Mrs. Pollock mentioned. Heard it twice, actually. Once around 10 in the morning, and again around 8 that evening. But I didn't see it either time. Was working in the shed behind the church, replacing some kneelers." Miss Marple's pulse quickened slightly. The mysterious motorcyclist had returned Friday evening, a detail Mrs. Pollock had evidently not observed. How interesting! Did it stay long the second time? Couldn't say for certain, but I noticed the vicarage study light was on later than usual that night. Still burning when I finished work around 9:30. 2 visits from the same motorcycle in one day, a late-burning study light, and by Saturday evening, someone searching the vicar's papers. The pattern suggested a sequence of events rather than a random crime. "I do hope the inspector finds Reverend Clement soon," Miss Marple said gently. "The whole village is terribly concerned." "Aye," Bradley agreed, though his tone carried something more complex than simple concern. "Though I wonder—" He caught himself before completing the thought. "What do you wonder, Mr. Bradley?" The sexton looked around as though ensuring they were alone, then leaned closer to Miss Marple. "I wonder if perhaps the vicar didn't disappear of his own accord. Seemed to me he'd been acting like a man with a secret to hide these past few weeks. Not saying he did anything wrong, you understand. But sometimes even good men find themselves in situations they can't easily explain." Before Miss Marple could explore this intriguing observation further, Inspector Craddock appeared at the vicarage gate, his expression serious. "Mr. Bradley, I'm glad to find you here. I need to ask you some additional questions about the church. Keys, Miss Marple." He nodded politely in her direction. "Good morning," as Bradley reluctantly followed the inspector back toward the vicarage. Miss Marple continued her walk home, her mind working through the morning's revelations. The mysterious morphine prescription, the failed attempt on the church safe, and, most intriguingly, Tom Bradley's suggestion that Samuel Clement might have disappeared voluntarily. Each piece of information seemed to complicate rather than clarify the picture, but in Miss Marple's experience, the truth usually lay not in the obvious explanations, but in the small inconsistencies that most people overlooked, like motorcycles that made return visits, or sedatives prescribed for non-existent patients. Chapter 10. The Hunter Becomes the Hunted. The old mill stood like a sentinel beside the River Wickham, its weathered stone walls and broken wheel bearing testimony to decades of neglect. Miss Marple had insisted on accompanying Inspector Craddock, and Mr. Patterson, arguing with surprising firmness that her knowledge of local geography could prove valuable in tracking the fugitives. "I do wish you'd remain in the village, Miss Marple," Inspector Craddock said as their small party approached the mill through the overgrown footpath. "This situation could become quite dangerous. I understand your concern, Inspector, but I suspect the danger lies not in who we're pursuing, but in who might be pursuing them." Miss Marple paused at a bend in the path, noting fresh footprints in the soft earth beside the stream. 2 sets of tracks made within the last hour. One moving toward the mill, another circling around toward the back. Patterson knelt to examine the prints more closely, his movements sharp with professional training. One person definitely came this way recently, but the second set, these are older and heavier. Someone has been watching this location for some time. The mill's interior was a maze of abandoned machinery and accumulated debris from years of disuse. Shafts of afternoon sunlight slanted through broken windows, creating patterns of light and shadow that made careful observation essential. Miss Marple noticed immediately that someone had been using the mill recently. A makeshift camp had been established in what had once been the grain storage area. A sleeping bag, tinned food, and most significantly, several books and papers scattered across an improvised desk. "Dr. Pemberton's been hiding here," Inspector Craddock observed, examining the medical textbooks and personal items. "But where is he now?" "I think," said Miss Marple quietly, "the more pertinent question is who made those older tracks Patterson noticed. Dr. Pemberton wasn't hiding here voluntarily. He was hiding from someone." As if to emphasize her point, the sound of voices carried from outside growing steadily closer. Patterson immediately moved to the window, his hand reaching inside his coat for what Miss Marple suspected was a weapon. "2 men approaching," he whispered. "One appears to be Bradley. I can't identify the second from this distance." Inspector Craddock positioned himself near the main entrance, while Miss Marple found herself an observation point behind a large piece of abandoned machinery. The voices became clearer as they approached. "Told you this was foolish," a cultured voice was saying. "Coming here only exposes both of us unnecessarily." "I had to warn him," replied Tom Bradley's unmistakable accent. "Pemberton doesn't understand what these people are capable of, what Weber is capable of. Weber!" The second voice carried a note of sharp alarm. "Bradley, what exactly do you think you know about Weber?" Miss Marple felt her pulse quicken. Tom Bradley was speaking about Weber as though he was someone specific, someone whose identity he knew. "I know enough," Bradley replied, his voice growing stronger as they entered the mill. "I know that wireless equipment I've been maintaining in the church tower isn't for historical preservation. I know the signals I've been instructed to monitor aren't weather reports from London." The two men appeared in the main chamber, and Miss Marple felt a shock of recognition at the second figure. Colonel Clithering stood facing Tom Bradley, no longer the affable retired military man she'd known for years, but someone radiating quiet menace and barely contained authority. "Tom," Colonel Clithering said with dangerous calm, "you've always been useful because you followed orders without asking questions. Don't start now." Bradley's face showed a mixture of defiance and fear. "I followed orders because I believed we were still serving our country. But what we did to Samuel Clement, that wasn't patriotism. Samuel Clement was a threat to operations that you couldn't possibly understand. Operations that protect national security even now." Miss Marple's mind raced. Colonel Clithering speaking of ongoing operations, of national security concerns that justified murder. The man she'd known as a pillar of the village community was revealing himself to be something far more sinister. "Where's Dr. Pemberton?" Bradley demanded. "What have you done with him?" "Dr. Pemberton is safe, provided he remains sensible. Unlike his father, he understands the value of discretion." Patterson chose that moment to reveal himself, emerging from concealment with his weapon drawn. "Colonel Clithering, I'm placing you under arrest under the Official Secrets Act." Clithering's reaction was swift and telling. No surprise, only the grim satisfaction of someone whose suspicions had been confirmed. "Ah, Mr. Patterson, or should I say, Agent Patterson, I wondered when MI5 would finally take a direct interest in our little community. You've been under surveillance for months, Weber. Did you really think we hadn't identified you?" The revelation hung in the air like a physical blow. Colonel Clithering was Klaus Weber, the missing German agent who had successfully assumed a British identity and lived undetected in Little Wickham for 30 years. Weber's laugh was bitter. Surveillance? By whom? Young Dr. Pemberton. His conscience has been troubling him since he learned about his father's wartime activities, or perhaps through Samuel Clement's amateur historical research. Samuel Clement uncovered documents that pointed directly to your identity, Patterson declared. His translation work revealed the extent of your wartime network. Samuel Clement was an idealistic fool who didn't understand that some secrets serve the greater good. Yes, I recruited collaborators during the war. Yes, I maintained networks after the conflict ended. But everything I did served British interests in the long run. Miss Marple found this claim fascinating. Weber was presenting himself not as a German spy, but as a convert to British interests, someone whose betrayal of Germany had been genuine. "The morphine requests," Inspector Craddock said, suddenly understanding. Clement wasn't distributing drugs illegally. He was being blackmailed into providing them. Weber nodded approvingly. Samuel's little charity work provided perfect cover. We simply encouraged him to be more generous with his medical supplies. Dr. Pemberton's father had been much more cooperative in that regard. Tom Bradley stepped forward, his face flushed with anger. "You used us all, made us complicit in your schemes, without understanding what we were really doing. You maintained communications equipment and followed instructions, nothing more. I helped you monitor Samuel's research. I gave you access to the church whenever you needed it. I even helped you search the vicarage that Saturday night." Bradley's voice broke with anguish. "I thought I was protecting village secrets, not covering up murder." Miss Marple felt the final pieces clicking into place. Tom Bradley hadn't been near the vicarage to harm Samuel. He'd been there to help Webber search for the translation documents. "Where is Samuel Clement's body?" Patterson demanded, his weapon still trained on Weber. "Samuel chose his own fate," Weber replied coldly. "He threatened to expose everything, to reveal identities and operations that took decades to establish. He left me no choice. And Dr. Pemberton, where is he?" Weber glanced toward the river visible through the broken windows. Dr. Pemberton discovered his father's journals described my recruitment network in considerable detail. He'd been trying to make amends for his family's wartime choices, but threatened to become as problematic as Samuel. The implication sent a chill through Miss Marple. If Weber had already dealt with Dr. Pemberton, as he had with Samuel Clement, they might be too late to save him. Inspector Craddock moved forward to assist Patterson with the arrest, but Weber raised his hand in a gesture that somehow commanded attention, despite his apparent defeat. "Before you congratulate yourselves on solving this mystery," he said with a cruel smile, "you might want to consider who else in your charming village has been part of my network all these years. Did you really think I operated alone for 30 years?" Miss Marple felt her blood run cold. Weber's confidence suggested he had at least one more ally, someone still free and dangerous, someone who might, even now, be moving to eliminate the remaining witnesses to his decades-long deception. Chapter 11. The final gambit Weber's arrest proceeded with deceptive smoothness, but Miss Marple noticed the way his eyes kept darting toward the mill's rear entrance. When she followed his gaze, she glimpsed a shadow that shouldn't have been there. Someone else was watching from the woods beyond. "Inspector Craddock," she said quietly, "I believe we should search for Dr. Pemberton immediately. The longer we delay, the more difficult it may become to find him intact." Weber laughed, a sound devoid of warmth. "How perceptive of you, Miss Marple. Yes, time is indeed of the essence." Patterson kept his weapon trained on Weber, while Inspector Craddock secured the handcuffs. Tom Bradley had collapsed onto a wooden crate, his face buried in his hands, the weight of his unwitting complicity clearly overwhelming him. "Bradley," Patterson said sharply, "I need you to tell us everything about the communications equipment. Who else had access? Who gave you maintenance instructions?" Bradley looked up, his eyes red with anguish. "The instructions came through the post, unsigned. Always typewritten, never the same source. But—" He hesitated, glancing nervously at Weber. "Go on," Miss Marple encouraged gently. "It's time for the truth." "There were emergency protocols. If something went wrong, I was to contact a number in the village. A safe contact who could coordinate things." "Whose number?" Inspector Craddock demanded. "Mrs. Wainwright, the postmistress." Tyridis. Revelation hit the group like a physical blow. Mrs. Wainwright, who handled all the village's communications, who knew everyone's business, who had access to mail and telephone calls. The perfect position for someone coordinating a covert network. Weber's smile was triumphant. "Meredith Wainwright has been invaluable for 30 years. She knows exactly where Dr. Pemberton is, and more importantly, She knows what will happen to him if I don't return to the village by tonight." Miss Marple felt the familiar chill of recognition. Mrs. Wainwright had been the one spreading gossip about the financial irregularities, directing attention away from the true nature of Samuel's problems. She had access to Samuel's mail, including the threatening letters, and she would have known immediately about Mrs. Clement's telephone call requesting to speak with Miss Marple. "Inspector," Miss Marple said urgently, "we must return to the village immediately. Mrs. Wainwright will know by now that something has gone wrong. If Dr. Pemberton is still alive, she won't hesitate to eliminate that liability." Patterson was already moving toward the door. "Craddock, get Webber to the car. Bradley, you're coming with us. We may need your knowledge of the communications setup." As they prepared to leave, Webber spoke again, his voice carrying a note of genuine warning. "Miss Marple, you've been remarkably clever about piecing this together. But you should know that Meredith is far more dangerous than I ever was. During the war, she was the one who actually eliminated threats to our operation. I merely coordinated." Journey back to Little Wickham passed in tense silence. Miss Marple watched the familiar countryside roll past, seeing it now with different eyes. How many secrets had these quiet fields and ancient hedgerows witnessed? How many times had spies and collaborators used these very roads to carry out operations that shaped the war's outcome? As they approached the village, Miss Marple noticed something that made her lean forward sharply. "Inspector, look at the post office. The windows are dark and it's only 4 o'clock." The post office stood silent, its usually open door firmly closed. No lights showed in the windows, and the customary queue of villagers conducting late afternoon business was nowhere to be seen. "She knows," Patterson said grimly. "She's gone to ground." Inspector Craddock parked the car near the village green, and the group emerged to an eerily quiet scene. The usual bustling activity of late afternoon in Little Wickham was absent. Even the pub appeared closed, its windows shuttered. "It's too quiet," Tom Bradley observed, his voice barely above a whisper. "Where is everyone?" Miss Marple had been wondering the same thing. In her experience, when a village this size suddenly emptied of people, it usually meant either celebration or catastrophe. Today, she suspected it was neither. It meant evacuation. "Mrs. Wainwright has been busy," she murmured. "I suspect she's arranged for people to be elsewhere this afternoon." They approached the post office cautiously, but found it thoroughly abandoned. The till was empty, important documents were gone, and the telephone exchange showed signs of hasty disconnection. Patterson emerged from behind the counter, his face grim. "Professional job. She's destroyed all the records, cleared out anything incriminating, but she's left this." He held up a single typewritten note. "Dr. Pemberton is alive for now. Come alone to the old cemetery behind the church at sunset. Bring Webber. Any attempt at deception will result in the doctor's immediate death. The 30-year game ends tonight." Inspector Craddock studied the note. "It's a trap, obviously." "Of course it's a trap," Miss Marple agreed. "But it's also our only chance to save Dr. Pemberton. Mrs. Wainwright is offering to exchange him for Webber, but I suspect she has no intention of honouring any such arrangement." Webber, who had been silent during their investigation of the post office, finally spoke. "Meredith always preferred direct solutions to complex problems. She won't negotiate. She'll try to eliminate everyone who knows about the network. Then why suggest the exchange at all? Bradley asked. Miss Marple considered this carefully. Because she needs to retrieve something from Weber himself. Information, perhaps, or access to resources she can't obtain otherwise. Patterson was already planning. We'll surround the cemetery, establish multiple observation points. When she appears with Pemberton— No, Weber interrupted. You don't understand Meredith's methods. She'll have contingencies, multiple escape routes, probably explosives as insurance. She's been planning for this possibility for years. Miss Marple nodded slowly. Dr. Weber is quite right. Mrs. Wainwright has had 30 years to prepare for. Exposure. She won't have left anything to chance. Then what do you suggest, Miss Marple? Inspector Craddock asked, his frustration evident. Miss Marple was quiet for a long moment, her mind working through the possibilities. Finally, she looked up with the expression Tom Bradley would later describe as absolutely terrifying in its determination. I suggest we give Mrs. Wainwright exactly what she wants, she said, but perhaps not quite in the manner she expects. The sun was already beginning its descent toward the horizon, casting long shadows across the village green. In less than 2 hours, the final confrontation between past and present would play out in Little Wycombe's ancient cemetery. Miss Marple only hoped that when the game finally ended, there would be survivors left to tell the tale. But first, she had a plan to implement, one that would require considerable courage from everyone involved, and a deep understanding of human nature's capacity for both loyalty and betrayal.